A new beginning. Ethan Carter sat on his worn leather couch, the quiet hum of his old refrigerator filling the empty spaces of his small suburban home. The house was silent, too silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Ethan sipped his lukewarm coffee, staring at the stack of unopened mail on the coffee table. Since his wife's passing 2 years ago, the house had lost its warmth. Now it was just a structure, a collection of walls and windows that kept the world out but trapped the loneliness within. The knock at the door startled him. Setting his mug down, he opened the door to find Mrs. Ellison, his elderly neighbor, standing with a kind smile and a tin of cookies. "Thought you might need these," she said warmly. Ethan forced a smile. "Thanks, Mrs. Ellison. You didn't have to." "Well, I heard about the adoption fair at the community center," she said, stepping inside. "There are a lot of kids who need homes, Ethan. Maybe you should stop by." Ethan's smile faltered. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." Mrs. Ellison patted his arm. "Sometimes we don't think we're ready for the things we need most." That night, her words lingered. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying images of Grace, her laughter, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. Their dream of a big family had died with her, but maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Ellison was right. 2 weeks later, Ethan found himself at the community center, surrounded by cheerful banners and the sound of children's laughter. He felt out of place among the smiling couples and excited children. As he wandered aimlessly, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "First time here." He turned to see a woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. "Yeah," he admitted. "I'm Ethan Carter." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Carter. I'm Ms. Daniels, one of the social workers." She gestured toward a small table. "Why don't we talk?" Ethan followed her, feeling like a fish out of water. Ms. Daniels explained the adoption process, her tone professional but warm. Then she paused, her expression turning serious. "There's a special case I'd like to discuss with you." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Special?" "We have 5 sisters who need a home. They've been through a lot, and keeping them together has been a challenge." Curious, Ethan followed her gaze to a corner of the room. 5 girls sat together, their bond evident. The oldest, Ava, was tall and composed for her age, her watchful eyes scanning the room as if guarding her sisters. Next to her, Melody sketched quietly in a notebook, her face calm and focused. Olivia, the quiet middle child, sat slightly apart, her gaze fixed on the floor. Harper, the second youngest, was a ball of energy, bouncing around with a wide grin, while the youngest, Rose, clung to a tattered teddy bear. Ms. Daniels introduced them, and Ethan knelt to meet their gazes. Ava's eyes were sharp and questioning. "Why would you want all of us?" she asked bluntly. Her directness caught him off guard. He looked at each of them, their personalities shining through even in those brief moments. "Because you belong together," he said simply. The first few weeks were chaotic. Ethan had been prepared for challenges, but he underestimated just how much adjusting 5 lives would require. The girls came with routines, quirks, and baggage that Ethan couldn't have anticipated. On their first morning together, the chaos began before sunrise. Harper threw a tantrum over her shoes. "They're too tight," she wailed, stomping her feet. At the kitchen table, Rose refused her cereal, her lips pressed together in a stubborn line. Meanwhile, Ava stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Olivia needs her lunch," she said, her tone more demanding than helpful. Ethan fumbled through the morning, burning toast, forgetting the lunchbox, and nearly tripping over backpacks strewn across the floor. By the time they left for school, he felt like he'd run a marathon. That evening, Mrs. Ellison stopped by with another tin of cookies. She sat in the kitchen, watching Ethan with a knowing smile. "You've got your hands full," she said, her tone light but understanding. Ethan sighed. "You could say that." Mrs. Ellison's gaze softened. "They'd been through a lot, Ethan. Kids like that don't just carry memories. They carry scars." Her words stayed with him. That night, Ethan tucked the girls into bed, their rooms filled with mismatched furniture and hastily chosen decorations. As he walked past their door, he heard Ava whisper, "We're safe here for now." Safe. The word echoed in his mind. Safe from what? He didn't ask. Not yet. Trust was fragile, and he knew he had to earn it. The next day, Ethan noticed subtle signs of the girl's past. A loud truck backfired on the street, and Harper froze, her eyes wide with fear. Olivia flinched when Ethan accidentally dropped a pan in the kitchen. Even Ava, so composed and confident, checked the locks on the doors twice before bed. That evening, Ethan took Harper and Rose to the park, hoping to lighten the mood. But when a dog barked nearby, Harper clung to his leg, trembling. "I want to go home," she whispered. Ethan knelt beside her. "You're safe," he said, his voice gentle. But the words felt hollow, as if they weren't enough to erase whatever haunted her. Later, as he read bedtime stories, Rose climbed onto the couch beside him, clutching her teddy bear. The other girls stayed upstairs, their absence heavy in the quiet living room. "You're safe here," he whispered again, more to himself than to her. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He thought about the way Ava's eyes darted toward the windows, the way Melody's drawings had grown darker, filled with shadowy figures. There was something unspoken between them, a tension that lingered even in their moments of laughter. Ethan resolved to dig deeper. The girls had a story, and he was determined to uncover it, not to invade their privacy, but to understand them. Whatever haunted them, he would face it with them. They were his family now, and he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. Whispers in the dark. Ethan woke before dawn, the house still wrapped in the silence of early morning. He couldn't shake the conversation he'd overheard the night before. Ava's words, whispered with urgency, played on repeat in his mind. "If she finds us, we run." The implications were as chilling as they were unclear. The coffee machine gurgled in the kitchen as he stared out the window. The backyard looked peaceful, the grass glistening with dew in the faint light. But that peace felt fragile. A sense of unease gnawed at him, one that he couldn't quite name. By the time the girls woke up, Ethan had decided to spend the day with them. No work, no distractions. He needed to understand them better, to make them feel safe enough to open up. The day began with pancakes, though Harper insisted on helping, which turned the kitchen into a flower-dusted battlefield. Melody watched quietly from the table, her sketchpad in hand. Ava lingered in the doorway, her expression unreadable, while Rose giggled as Ethan flipped a pancake high into the air, missing the pan entirely. "Oops, guess that one's for the floor monster," Ethan joked, earning a hesitant smile from Harper. As the morning wore on, the tension seemed to lift. The girls relaxed, their laughter filling the house. It was a rare sound, and Ethan savored it. He saw glimpses of who they could be, carefree and happy. If only the shadows of their past would let them go. After breakfast, they piled into Ethan's old SUV and headed to the local park. The playground was nearly empty, save for a few toddlers and their parents. Harper and Rose ran toward the swings, their laughter carried on the breeze. Olivia hung back, sitting on a bench with Melody, who sketched quietly. Ava stood near the edge of the playground, her arms crossed as she scanned the area. Ethan approached her, crouching to meet her gaze. "You're allowed to have fun, you know." Ava shrugged, her eyes never leaving the perimeter. "Someone has to keep watch." "Keep watch for what?" he asked gently. Ava stiffened, her gaze darting to his before returning to the trees. "Nothing. Just, in case." Ethan didn't press further. Instead, he sat beside her, his presence a quiet reassurance. They sat in silence, the sounds of the park filling the space between them. Slowly, Ava's posture relaxed, and for a brief moment, she seemed like any other 14-year-old girl. The peace didn't last. That evening, as Ethan washed dishes and the girls played in the living room, he heard the faint sound of footsteps on the front porch. He froze, his heart pounding. The girls had all come inside. He checked twice. Setting the dish down carefully, he dried his hands and walked toward the door. Peeking through the peephole, he saw nothing. The porch was empty. He opened the door cautiously, stepping outside. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, and the street was quiet. But as he turned to go back inside, his eyes caught a faint white corner sticking out from the mailbox. Ethan pulled out the envelope. It was plain, unmarked, and sealed. He tore it open, his pulse quickening. Inside was a single sheet of paper with jagged handwriting. "You took what belongs to me. You'll pay for this." His blood ran cold. He scanned the street again, but it remained empty, eerily quiet. Pocketing the note, he locked the door and double-checked all the windows. When he returned to the living room, Ava was watching him, her expression guarded. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice neutral but her eyes sharp. Ethan forced a smile. "Just making sure everything's locked up." Ava didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. That night, Ethan sat in his home office, staring at the note. He opened his laptop and typed the name he'd found in the adoption paperwork, Charlotte Haynes, into a search engine. The results were sparse, mostly generic social media profiles. But as he dug deeper, he found news articles that sent a chill down his spine. Charlotte Haynes had a history. She'd been arrested multiple times for neglect and endangerment, her charges ranging from child abuse to drug possession. Most of the articles were years old, but one particularly disturbing report caught his attention. It described a raid on a dilapidated house where several children had been found living in squalor. The name listed among the rescued children was familiar: Ava Haynes. Ethan sat back in his chair, the pieces falling into place. Ava and her sisters had escaped something horrifying, but Charlotte hadn't disappeared. The note proved that she was still out there, and she wanted them back. The next morning, Ethan didn't mention the note or his findings to the girls. Instead, he threw himself into fortifying their home. He installed new locks on all the doors and windows, set up motion-activated lights around the perimeter, and contacted a security company to install cameras. "Why are you doing all this?" Ava asked, watching as he tested the new locks. "Just want to make sure we're safe," Ethan said, keeping his tone light. Ava's eyes narrowed. "Safe from what?" Ethan hesitated. "Sometimes it's better to be prepared." Ava didn't look convinced, but she didn't push further. She simply nodded and walked away. That evening, Ethan found Harper sitting in the hallway, clutching his old firefighter jacket like a security blanket. "Can I keep this?" she asked, her voice small. "Of course," Ethan said, kneeling beside her. "But why do you want it?" Harper shrugged, her fingers gripping the fabric tightly. "It smells like you." Ethan's heart ached. He ruffled her hair and promised, "You're safe here, Harper. I won't let anything happen to you." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her small body relaxing slightly. Later that night, Ethan sat at his desk, watching the security camera feeds on his laptop. The house was quiet, the girls all asleep. But as he scanned the footage, a shadow moved near the back fence. Ethan's heart jumped. He rewound the footage, watching closely. The shadow appeared again, lingering near the fence before disappearing into the darkness. Grabbing a flashlight, Ethan stepped outside. The night was cool, the air thick with tension. He scanned the yard, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark. Everything looked normal, but his gut told him otherwise. Returning inside, Ethan locked the door behind him and leaned against it, his mind racing. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. Charlotte Haynes was out there, and she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. As Ethan climbed the stairs to check on the girls, he heard faint whispers coming from their room. He paused outside the door, listening. "If she comes back, we run," Ava's voice said, steady and determined. "Where would we go?" Melody asked, her voice trembling. "We'll figure it out," Ava replied. "We always do." Ethan's heart ached for them. These girls, so young, had carried the weight of survival for far too long. He knocked gently, and the whispers stopped immediately. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, opening the door slightly. Ava nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "We're fine." Ethan nodded, pretending not to notice the tension in their faces. "Good night, then." "Good night," Ava replied, her voice calm but firm. As Ethan walked back to his room, he resolved to protect them at all costs. They were his daughters now, and no one, not even Charlotte Haynes, would take them away. Shadows of the past. The morning sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, but its warmth did little to dispel the cold knot in Ethan's chest. The ominous note sat hidden in his desk drawer, but the unease it had planted lingered in every corner of the house. He couldn't shake the image of that shadow near the fence, or the faint whispers he had overheard from the girl's room the night before. He sat at the table with his laptop, staring at the name that had haunted him for days. Charlotte Haynes. Her face stared back at him from a mugshot, sharp cheekbones, hollow eyes, and a cruel twist to her mouth. The accompanying articles painted a grim picture: arrests for neglect, substance abuse, and even accusations of trafficking. It was clear that Charlotte had lived a life of chaos, dragging the girls into a dark and twisted world before they had been rescued. Ethan couldn't imagine the pain Ava and her sisters had endured, but one thing was certain: Charlotte wasn't done with them. That note made it clear. She wanted them back, or worse, she wanted revenge. Ethan spent the next several hours making preparations. He called the school to notify them about potential issues, speaking in careful terms so as not to alarm anyone. He installed additional cameras, positioning them to eliminate blind spots around the house. The girls noticed his restlessness, but didn't question it, except for Ava. "Why are you acting weird?" she asked, leaning against the doorway of the living room as Ethan worked on his laptop. Ethan glanced at her, unsure of how much to share. "Just making sure everything is set up around here. We got a big family now. That means keeping things extra safe." Ava's gaze was sharp, as if she were trying to piece together a puzzle he wasn't showing her. "You think she's coming, don't you?" Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Ethan froze. "Who?" "You know who." Ava crossed her arms, her posture rigid. "Charlotte." Ethan hesitated, debating how to respond. "I don't know for sure," he admitted, "but I won't let anything happen to you or your sisters. That's a promise." Ava's lips tightened, and for a moment, she looked much older than her 14 years. "She's dangerous," she said quietly. "She doesn't care about anyone but herself." Ethan nodded, his heart aching for the burden this young girl carried. "I know, but you don't have to worry about her anymore. That's my job now." Ava didn't reply. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan to wonder just how deep her scars ran. That night, the house was unusually quiet. The girls went to bed without complaint, their usual laughter and whispers subdued. Ethan sat in his office, watching the camera feeds. Each angle showed a still and empty yard, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. Around midnight, a soft creak echoed from the front porch. Ethan's breath hitched as he leaned closer to the monitor, switching to the front camera. A shadow moved across the porch, just out of the camera's view. His pulse quickened. Grabbing a flashlight, Ethan moved silently through the house. He paused at the front door, peering through the peephole. The porch appeared empty, but the faint sound of rustling leaves reached his ears. He turned on the porch light and opened the door cautiously. A white envelope lay on the doormat, identical to the one from before. Ethan's hands trembled as he picked it up and opened it. Inside was another note, written in the same jagged handwriting. "You can't keep them. They're mine." Ethan's blood boiled. He stepped outside, shining the flashlight into the yard. "If you're out there, you'd better leave now," he called, his voice firm. The street remained silent, the shadows giving nothing away. He retreated inside, locking the door behind him. He placed the note in the drawer with the first, his mind racing. This wasn't just a threat. It was a challenge. The next morning, Ethan decided it was time to confront the past. He called Ms. Daniels, the social worker who had helped with the adoption. She picked up after a few rings, her voice warm but professional. "Ethan, how are things going?" "We need to talk about the girls," he said, his voice tight. "I need to know everything about their history." There was a pause on the other end. "Ethan, you know we can't disclose all the details. Much of their case is sealed for their protection." "I understand," Ethan said, his frustration mounting. "But Charlotte Haynes is sending me threatening notes. She's been on my property. I need to know what I'm up against." Ms. Daniels' voice turned serious. "Charlotte Haynes is a dangerous individual. The girls were removed from her custody after an investigation revealed severe abuse and neglect. She's made attempts to contact them before, but we believe she had moved out of state. I'll notify the authorities immediately." Ethan felt a mix of relief and anger. "Why wasn't I told about this sooner?" "We didn't want to scare you or the girls," Ms. Daniels said. "But it's clear she hasn't let go. Please be vigilant, Ethan. Charlotte doesn't care about the law or what's right. She only cares about control." Ethan hung up, his resolve hardening. He spent the day reinforcing the house, moving the girls' rooms to the second floor, and setting up an emergency plan. He even gave Ava a whistle to keep under her pillow, instructing her to use it if she ever felt unsafe. That evening, he sat the girls down for a family meeting. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice steady. "I've been getting notes from someone claiming they want you back. Her name is Charlotte Haynes." The room fell silent. Ava's face hardened, her fists clenching. Melody looked down at her sketchpad, her hand trembling. Olivia hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. Harper and Rose clung to each other, their small bodies shaking. "She's not taking us," Ava said firmly, her voice like steel. Ethan nodded. "That's right. She's not. This is your home now, and I'll do everything in my power to protect you." "But what if she comes?" Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. "Then we'll be ready," Ethan said. He looked at each of them, his gaze filled with determination. "You're safe here, I promise." That night, Ethan barely slept. He stayed up watching the camera feeds, his nerves on edge. Just past 2 a.m., the motion sensor light in the backyard flickered on. Ethan's heart raced as he switched to the backyard camera. A figure stood near the fence, their face obscured by the shadows. Without hesitation, Ethan grabbed his phone and called the police. "There's someone on my property," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I've got them on camera." He stayed on the line, watching as the figure moved closer to the house. The operator assured him that officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours. Finally, flashing blue and red lights illuminated the street, and the figure disappeared into the night. The police searched the area, but found no one. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, approached Ethan. "We'll increase patrols in the neighborhood," he said. "But whoever this is, they're careful. Keep your doors locked and your cameras running." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. As the police left, he looked up at the house, where the girls' faces peered out from the upstairs window. They were scared, but he wouldn't let that fear win. Breaking the silence. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of day that seemed to echo the tension in Ethan's chest. The police had assured him they would patrol the neighborhood, but their words felt like a Band-Aid over a gaping wound. Whoever Charlotte Haynes was, she wasn't going to give up easily. Ethan could feel it in his bones. Downstairs, the girls sat around the breakfast table, their usual chatter absent. Harper poked at her scrambled eggs with her fork, while Melody doodled absent-mindedly on a napkin. Ava sat stiffly, her eyes darting toward the window every few seconds. Ethan placed a fresh plate of pancakes on the table. "I was thinking we could have a movie day today," he said, forcing cheer into his voice. "Stay in, make popcorn, maybe even build a fort in the living room." Ava gave him a skeptical look, but Harper perked up slightly. "Can we watch the princess one?" she asked, her voice soft. Absolutely, Ethan said, smiling. Anything you want. As the girls reluctantly agreed to the plan, Ethan couldn't help but notice the shadow that hung over them. The previous night's events had shaken them, even if they didn't say it out loud. By mid-morning, the living room was transformed into a fortress of blankets and pillows. Harper and Rose were giggling under the makeshift tent, while Melody and Olivia sat nearby, engrossed in an animated movie. Ava, however, lingered by the window, her arms crossed and her gaze distant. Ethan approached her, crouching slightly to meet her eye level. Ava, you don't always have to be the guard. You're allowed to be a kid too. She looked at him, her expression a mix of defiance and vulnerability. I've always been the guard, she said quietly. It's the only way we've stayed safe. Ethan's heart ached. You don't have to do it alone anymore. I'm here now. Ava's jaw tightened, and she turned back to the window. You don't know her like we do. She doesn't stop. Then we won't stop either, Ethan said firmly. Whatever it takes, I'll protect you. Ava didn't reply, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That afternoon, Ethan decided it was time to dig deeper. He had promised the girls he would protect them, but to do that, he needed to understand the full scope of what they had endured. He locked himself in his office, pulling up every piece of information he could find on Charlotte Haynes. As he sifted through articles and public records, a clearer picture began to emerge. Charlotte had spent years evading authorities, moving from state to state, leaving a trail of destruction in her wake. She had been arrested multiple times, but charges were often dropped due to lack of evidence or procedural errors. Her most recent arrest, however, was tied to a trafficking ring, one that had been dismantled shortly after Ava and her sisters were removed from her custody. Ethan's stomach churned as he read the details. The girls had lived through horrors he could barely comprehend. No wonder they were so guarded, so wary of trusting anyone. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He closed his laptop quickly as Melody peeked in, her sketchpad clutched to her chest. Can I show you something? She asked hesitantly. Of course, Ethan said, gesturing for her to come in. Melody climbed onto the chair beside him, flipping open her sketchpad. On the page was a detailed drawing of their family. Ethan recognized himself, Ava, and the other girls, all smiling and holding hands. But in the background, a dark figure loomed, its features obscured. Who's this? Ethan asked, pointing to the shadowy figure. Melody's grip on the sketchpad tightened. She's watching, she whispered. She always watches. Ethan swallowed hard. Melody, has she tried to talk to you? Or come near the house? Melody shook her head. Not yet, but she will. That evening, Ethan gathered the girls in the living room. He knelt in front of them, his voice calm but firm. I need you to tell me everything you know about Charlotte. Anything you've seen, heard, or felt since you've been here. The girls exchanged uneasy glances before Ava spoke up. She's been following us for years, she said. Even after we were taken away, she always found a way to leave messages or show up. What kind of messages? Ethan asked. Notes, like the ones you got, Ava said. Sometimes she'd leave things, like a stuffed animal we lost or a necklace she used to wear, just to remind us she was still there. Harper's voice trembled as she added. She said she'd take us back, that no one could keep us away from her. Ethan's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. She's wrong. She doesn't have that power anymore. But she doesn't care about rules, Ava said, her voice breaking. She only cares about control. Ethan reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Ava's shoulder. She's not getting anywhere near you, I promise. Later that night, as the girls slept, Ethan sat in his office, staring at the camera feeds. He felt helpless, knowing Charlotte was out there, watching, waiting. He needed a plan, something stronger than cameras and locks. He needed to take the fight to her. He began making calls, reaching out to private investigators and security consultants. If the police couldn't stop Charlotte, He would find someone who could. Around 3 a.m., the motion sensor lights flickered on again. Ethan's eyes snapped to the monitor, his heart pounding. This time, the figure was clearer. A woman with wild hair and a gaunt face, standing near the edge of the yard. Ethan grabbed his phone and called the police, his voice shaking with urgency. "She's back. She's in my yard right now." The dispatcher assured him that officers were on their way, but Ethan didn't wait. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the door and stepped outside, his heart hammering in his chest. The woman was gone, but the gate was swinging open. Ethan scanned the yard, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "If you come near my family again, I swear," he shouted, his voice echoing into the night. A faint laugh drifted from the shadows, sending a chill down his spine. "You can't keep them," a voice whispered. "They're mine." Ethan spun around, but the yard was empty. The laugh lingered in his ears as the police arrived, their flashing lights doing little to dispel the sense of dread that had settled over him. Back inside, Ethan locked every door and window, his hands trembling. He checked on the girls, who were thankfully still asleep. As he stood in the hallway, watching them, he made a vow. "This ends now," he whispered. "One way or another, I'm going to stop her. The fight begins." The first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains as Ethan sat at the kitchen table, nursing his third cup of coffee. Sleep had evaded him completely. The events of the night replayed in his mind like a broken record. The laugh, the voice, the figure in the yard. Charlotte Haynes wasn't just a shadow from the past anymore. She was a real, immediate threat. The girls shuffled into the kitchen one by one, their faces weary. Harper clung to Ethan's old firefighter jacket, which now dragged along the floor behind her like a protective cape. Ava carried a quiet tension in her shoulders, while Melody stayed close to Olivia, who avoided meeting anyone's eyes. Rose clutched her teddy bear, her small hand gripping Ethan's sleeve as she climbed onto his lap. "Dad," Ava said, breaking the silence, "what are we going to do?" Ethan's heart swelled at the word. Dad. It was the first time any of them had called him that. He reached across the table, placing his hand over Ava's. "We're going to stop her. For good." After breakfast, Ethan set his plan into motion. He contacted a private security firm, explaining the situation in detail. They agreed to send a team to assess the property and implement additional safety measures. Ethan didn't care about the cost. Protecting the girls was priceless. By midday, a pair of security consultants arrived. They were no-nonsense professionals who immediately began mapping the house and yard. Cameras were repositioned for better coverage, and an advanced alarm system was installed. Panic buttons were discreetly placed throughout the house, with one in each of the girls' rooms. "These are tied directly to our monitoring center and the police," one of the consultants explained. "If anything happens, just press the button, and help will be on the way." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. This was more than just about keeping them safe. It was about reclaiming their peace. While the security team worked, Ethan sat down with Ms. Daniels, who had rushed over after his call. She brought a thick folder filled with court documents, case notes, and Charlotte's history. "This is everything I could access," she said, spreading the files across the dining room table. "Charlotte Haynes is more dangerous than we initially realized." Ethan scanned the documents, his jaw tightening. The records detailed years of abuse, manipulation, and criminal activity. Charlotte had been arrested for fraud, drug trafficking, and even assaulting a social worker during a custody hearing. "What's worse," Ms. Daniels continued, "is that she has connections. People who owe her favors. She's resourceful, and she knows how to evade the law." Ethan's eyes landed on a recent report. It indicated that Charlotte had been sighted in a nearby city just a few weeks before the adoption was finalized. The timing wasn't a coincidence. "She's been watching us this whole time," Ethan muttered. Ms. Daniels nodded. "I've already contacted the authorities, but we need to be proactive. If you see her again, don't confront her. Call the police immediately." Ethan looked at the girls, who were huddled together in the living room, their laughter subdued as they played with blocks. He clenched his fists. I'll do whatever it takes to protect them. That evening, Ethan sat the girls down for another family meeting. He explained the new security measures, showing them how to use the panic buttons and emphasizing that they should never open the door for anyone. "Will she come inside?" Harper asked, her voice trembling. "Not if I can help it," Ethan said, pulling her onto his lap. "We're safe here, I promise." Ava, ever the protector, nodded solemnly. "If she comes, we'll be ready." Ethan smiled at her determination. "You don't have to fight this battle alone anymore, Ava. That's what I'm here for." As night fell, Ethan's vigilance grew. He monitored the camera feeds obsessively, his laptop glowing in the darkened office. Every shadow, every flicker of movement set his nerves on edge. The hours crept by, the quiet of the house broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. At 2 a.m., the motion sensor in the backyard activated. Ethan's heart leaped as he switched to the live feed. The figure was back, standing just outside the gate. This time, the camera captured her face, wild eyes, tangled hair, and a twisted smirk. Charlotte. Ethan didn't hesitate. He dialed 911, his voice steady but urgent. "She's here. Charlotte Haynes is on my property." The dispatcher assured him that officers were en route, but Ethan couldn't wait. He grabbed the baseball bat from beside the door and stepped outside, keeping the floodlights on. "Charlotte," he called, his voice echoing through the still night. "Stay away from my family." The woman's laugh was sharp, cutting through the silence. "You think you can keep them from me? They're mine." "They're not yours anymore," Ethan said, his grip tightening on the bat. "Leave, or I'll make sure you never come near them again." Charlotte took a step closer, her expression menacing. "You don't scare me, Carter. You have no idea what I'm capable of." The sound of sirens cut through the tension, their flashing lights illuminating the street. Charlotte's smirk faltered as she backed away, disappearing into the darkness just as the police arrived. The officers searched the area thoroughly but found no trace of her. One of them, a seasoned sergeant, approached Ethan. "She's slippery, but we'll catch her. In the meantime, keep your guard up. She's clearly not done." Ethan nodded, his resolve unshaken. "I'm not letting her win." The next morning, the girls were quiet as they ate breakfast. Harper clung to Ethan's side, while Melody doodled nervously on a napkin. Even Ava seemed subdued, her usual bravado dimmed. "We're going to be okay," Ethan said, his voice firm. "No matter what happens, I won't let her hurt you." Melody looked up from her sketchpad, her eyes wide. "Promise." Ethan knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Promise." Determined to give the girls a sense of normalcy, Ethan took them to the park that afternoon. The fresh air seemed to lift their spirits, if only slightly. Harper and Rose climbed the jungle gym, while Olivia and Melody sat on a bench, sharing Melody's sketchpad. Ava stayed close to Ethan, her eyes scanning the area like a sentry. "Do you ever just relax?" Ethan asked her with a smile. Ava shrugged. "I can't." "You don't have to carry all this weight, Ava," Ethan said gently. "Let me help." For a moment, her tough exterior cracked. "I just don't want to lose them again." "You won't," Ethan said, his voice steady. "You're safe now. I won't let her take you." As they returned home, Ethan noticed a black car idling near the end of their street. His stomach tightened as he pulled into the driveway, watching the car in his rearview mirror. It drove off slowly, its windows tinted. Ethan's phone buzzed. It was Ms. Daniels. "Ethan, we've got a lead on Charlotte. She's been spotted in your area. The police are tracking her, but be extra careful." "Understood," Ethan said, his jaw clenching. He glanced at the girls, who were unloading their things from the car, oblivious to the danger that loomed. That night, Ethan stayed awake, watching the camera feeds with a mix of exhaustion and determination. Charlotte might have slipped away this time, but he wouldn't stop fighting. For the first time in years, the girls had a real home, a real family, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away. The showdown. The house stood quiet as the night deepened, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The tension in his chest had grown unbearable, a storm brewing on the edges of his senses. He sat in his office, staring at the glowing camera feeds. Each angle showed the same still images of the yard, illuminated by motion-activated floodlights. The girls were asleep upstairs, but Ethan doubted they felt safe. After days of threats and sightings, even the most comforting words couldn't erase their fears. Ava, in particular, seemed more withdrawn. Her attempts to keep her sisters cheerful were valiant, but her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. Ethan adjusted the bat resting beside his chair. He had gone over every possible scenario in his head, replaying how he would react if Charlotte dared to step onto their property again. Tonight felt different. It felt final. Just past midnight, the motion sensors in the backyard triggered. Ethan's heart skipped as he leaned closer to the monitor. The screen showed the same figure he had seen before, Charlotte Haynes. This time, she wasn't lingering near the gate. She was moving toward the house. Ethan grabbed his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed 911. "She's here," he said urgently. "She's trying to break in." The dispatcher assured him that officers were on their way, but Ethan knew how long that could take. His eyes darted to the screen. Charlotte was now near the back door, her movements deliberate. She carried something in her hand, something long and metallic. Ethan grabbed the bat and crept toward the kitchen, his footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. He reached the back door just as the sound of scraping metal against glass filled the air. Charlotte was trying to pry the door open. "Stop right there," Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the silence. The scraping stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of their breathing. Then Charlotte's voice came, low and venomous. "You think you can keep them from me? You have no idea what I've done for those girls." "They're not yours," Ethan said firmly. "They're my daughters now, and you're never getting near them again." Charlotte laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "They'll never be yours. You can't protect them from me." The floodlights illuminated her face as she stepped back from the door, her smirk sending a chill down Ethan's spine. Before he could react, she lunged at the door, smashing the glass with the metal tool in her hand. Ethan barely had time to react. He swung the bat at the shattered door, forcing Charlotte to step back. "Get off my property," he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. Charlotte's smirk faded as she realized Ethan wasn't going to back down. "You think you can stop me?" she hissed, her eyes wild. "I always get what I want." "You're not getting them," Ethan said. "Not now. Not ever." The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder. Charlotte's eyes darted toward the street, her confidence faltering. "This isn't over," she spat, retreating into the shadows. Ethan didn't chase her. Instead, he locked the door as best he could and waited for the police to arrive. The officers searched the area thoroughly but found no sign of Charlotte. The sergeant in charge pulled Ethan aside. "She's resourceful, but we're putting a patrol unit on your street around the clock. We'll catch her." Ethan nodded, though his exhaustion was evident. "Thank you," he said, his voice strained. Upstairs, the girls huddled in Ava's room, their faces pale with fear. Ethan knelt beside them, his voice soft but steady. "She's gone for now. The police are watching the house. You're safe." Ava's eyes met his, filled with a mix of doubt and hope. "For how long?" she asked. "For as long as it takes," Ethan said. "I won't stop until she's out of our lives for good." The next day, Ethan received a call from Ms. Daniels. "The police found her car abandoned near the highway," she said. "It looks like she's trying to stay one step ahead, but they're closing in." "That's not good enough," Ethan said, his frustration boiling over. "She's still out there." "I understand," Ms. Daniels said gently. "But the girls are safe with you. That's what matters most." Ethan hung up, feeling a hollow sort of relief. He spent the day reinforcing the house further, installing heavier locks and additional cameras. The girls stuck close to him, their usual laughter replaced with uneasy silence. That evening, Ethan called a family meeting. The girls sat on the couch, their small bodies close together. "I know this has been hard," Ethan began, "but I need you to trust me. We're going to get through this." Ava's jaw tightened. What if she comes back? Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll be ready. But she's not going to win. We're a family, and families stick together." For the first time in days, Ava's expression softened. She nodded, her resolve matching his. Late that night, the phone rang. It was the police sergeant. "We've got her," he said. "Charlotte Haynes was found hiding in an abandoned warehouse. She's in custody." Ethan closed his eyes, relief washing over him. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. When he told the girls the news, their reactions varied. Harper clung to his leg, tears streaming down her face. Rose hugged her teddy bear tightly, whispering, "Is it really over?" Ava simply nodded, her tough exterior cracking just enough for Ethan to see the relief in her eyes. In the days that followed, the tension in the house began to lift. The girls started to smile again, their laughter slowly returning. Ethan worked tirelessly to rebuild their sense of security, creating a home where they could finally feel safe. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Ava spoke up. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. Ethan looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. "For what?" "For not giving up on us," Ava said. "For fighting for us." Ethan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You're my daughters," he said. "I'd fight the whole world for you." As the girls smiled, Ethan realized that their family had faced the storm and come out stronger. They were no longer just survivors. They were a family, bound by love and the unbreakable promise that they would always have each other. The end.